A very hearty welcome to all our friends who've dialed in for this webinar. Good morning to the folks across the world simultaneously. Good afternoon as well as good evening. Thank you so much, for sparing out time, especially in these testing times. But the context and the topic is very appropriate, considering the phase we've been going through. And after we get out of this phase, this becomes of even more and more importance. Specifically, that how can technology aid in agri-tech? And this is going to be a brilliant session because not only we have a legal expertise which will be shared with you, but also we have a few, couple of industry experts who are very renowned in their respective fields. Again, getting back from a context setting perspective, as you all would know, that the size of the nation would not matter when it comes to productivity from an agricultural perspective. So, just giving a hint on that, tiny countries, for example, Netherlands, it's a very small country, but it is amongst the top 5 global exporters of food by value in the world. You take Israel, right? Adverse weather conditions, desert issues in terms of water, but they absolutely excel in water management, water tech, irrigation techniques. Third example which I can give you is Japan for that perspective. Again, not a very large country, has its own challenges with an aging population, but high quality of food and agriculture. In fact, one of the most expensive vegetables and fruits, come from Japan. Now, what is common amongst all these and a lot of other developing countries who have a great agricultural output? The commonality is fantastic use of technology in the field of agri-tech, in the field of agriculture. Not only plain technologies, sophisticated technologies, disruptive technologies, which completely and absolutely increase productivity. How would this look specifically from an India perspective, right? Now, we all know that India is an agricultural country. It is, the largest source of employment in India is agriculture, directly and indirectly, the people employed with agriculture close to 62 to 63% in our country. We have another great advantage to our side. We have the second largest area of arable land in the world, second to the US, which is huge in terms of just sheer magnitude and volume. But the interesting link to both of these is that our GDP output specifically, around agriculture is somewhere around 15%. Now, considering the advantages from a population perspective, considering the dependency on agriculture, from an employment perspective and the arable land, the entire purpose of this discussion would revolve around how can, this productivity improve? How can this productivity be enhanced? And more importantly, how can disruptive technologies actually aid in all of this? Now, we all know that disruptive technologies in agri-tech have improved and are forthcoming more and more. So, there is AI, there are drones, there is GPS, there are soil sensors, there are so many things which we all are going to talk about and discuss further in this webinar. And I guess, it's the right time to just directly jump into it. And probably I will open it up with Kavita. Kavita, considering your experience with the government and, your experience in this space, what sort of receptiveness do you see from a public-private sector? Any opening comments or thoughts on the same?
Quickly share an overview of 2030 WRG and the work we are doing and, the context of how we link up to today's discussion. So the 2030 Water Resources Group was conceived in the World Economic Forum in 2008 and is now a part of the World Bank's Global Water Practice. We work in 11 countries, including India, where we are present in 4 states, which is Maharashtra, Karnataka, UP, and Madhya Pradesh, in sustainable management of water resources in thematic areas which are jointly identified with the state governments that we are working with. We work on a multi-stakeholder platform because while we all understand that water is a state subject, it's not the remit only of the government. We need collective call to action by the government, the private sector, and civil society. In Maharashtra, for example, we have 3 work streams, 2 of which are related to agriculture, agri-water, for water and livelihood security in rain-fed areas in Maharashtra. And the second one is around increasing water productivity in command areas. And the third work stream is on wastewater reuse and management. We also focus on mainstreaming gender in water leveraging alternative financing mechanisms and disruptive technologies, like you said a while ago, for the water sector. Being the secretariat for the Maharashtra Water Multi-Stakeholder Platform, and basically we are the secretariat for all the states' multi-stakeholder platforms that we work in. We feel a deep shared responsibility to look for specific areas where we can accelerate solutions to to this pandemic in particular. And we're supporting the government of Maharashtra convene meetings with multi-stakeholder groups, one of which is related to food security, towards building economic and social resilience in the medium to long term. And the question you asked, I think three specific points. I think you alluded to them in your opening. I have 3 points to make, which assert the need for these multi-stakeholder platforms between the public sector, the private sector, civil society, even academia, to accelerate collective call to action on various dimensions. So one is on the possible, use cases or, of drones and other disruptive technologies in agriculture. So COVID and the resultant lockdowns have, as we all know, led to many challenges in the sector arising from, non-availability of farm labor and logistics, basically labor and logistics, resulting in unprecedented supply chain disruptions and associated impact on rural incomes. I think this may pose long-term challenges in food security and the rural economy. If immediate actions are not taken, the agri-water economic productivity in the rural sector would be a threat, not only to the state or national GDP, but also to the water balance and associated climate resilience. Applications of disruptive technologies such as IoT metering to modulate soil moisture, soil health, agri-inputs, and harvesting techniques are well known and being implemented in pockets, as I understand. While we don't have the domain expertise as such, but I do understand drones and other disruptive technologies are also being used in some states and widely across the globe for specific applications in agriculture. Aditi, I think from C4IR can share more details, but I do know that drones have the ability to provide surveillance as well as data needed to run specific, machine learning and predictive analytics. Which could be useful for market players, policymakers, and more importantly to the farmers, individually, or to FPOs who manage a group of farmers. Also locating, production clusters on a real-time basis, especially in today's context, and linking them to aggregators and farmers or FPOs in the supply chain is another application that can be piloted in our opinion, using drones and other technologies, to help small and marginal farmers. The second point, I think I've already alluded to it, and you did too, is using drones possibly in conjunction with other disruptive technologies. And I would say that we need to look at drones as an implementation and monitoring tool. We shouldn't look at drones as an implementation and monitoring tool in agri in isolation, but combine them with other technologies like IoT metering for soil moisture. So, for example, say you have installed an IoT meter, which triggers an alarm if the moisture content goes, say, below 25% or whatever, so there is a higher chance of pest attack. And if the moisture content goes below 5%, you use drones to spray pesticides. So using other technologies in conjunction with drones, is what I'm saying, using an embedded or a modular approach. And the third is that while we can build, the use cases and the technology suite exists, but it is important to understand the cost benefit or the cost utility or benefit cost as we would like to call it, and business models that we can present to the government. And I think that's extremely critical because the government, both the center and the state, is extremely busy managing and coping with the situation on ground and its various dimensions. I think all of us understand that the scale and complexity is so wide and diverse. I think the private sector, which includes the drones operators and tech players, the federation, etc., they would be creating a fair bit of momentum on ground, but there is a need to deep dive into a cost benefit analysis, keeping today's context in mind, and present that to the government, as a holistic kind of proposition. Let's understand that there is a cost attached, and that this cost may or may not be justified for some smallholder farmers. Monies are being spent, diverted, repurposed for COVID. So we would need to help the government find or allocate budgets. And therefore, a cost benefit or a utility analysis would need to be done to build a compelling case for drones, in my opinion. And I would particularly like to mention here that while we build this cost utility, we need to bring out the fact that preventive action can have a positive effect on investments in the form of avoided future losses. And that may be, due to the pandemic or otherwise, but it's important to bring that dimension out clearly. That not all benefits are quantifiable, but it's basically preventing the cost of remediation at a future date. And for doing these things, I think a multi-stakeholder platform is best suited because you have to stitch various elements of this together. So in my opinion, a multi-stakeholder platform is required for understanding the use cases, building a cost-benefit analysis, architecting a solution, and then co-opting the government along the way. I think that is very important to get their buy-in, to get them, to give them synthesized information in these times of crisis when they are busy managing the front line. To get this off the ground. This is new stuff. I think we really need to make it easier for them. Also, a multi-stakeholder platform is required for alternative financing, not just for a pilot, but also to look at innovative ways of financing these disruptive technologies at scale. And I think that's the only way that this is going to create the desired impact. So I think that the public sector and private sector and civil society and the FPOs and farmers, everyone needs to come together on one platform towards collective action on each of these elements. And I think NDA itself, there is a case being made, I think, for the need of, for CSR rules, AIF regulations, etc., to be aligned and harmonized to also debottleneck possible alternative sources of financing. I think NDA is working on that paper, I'm aware. But I think the point I'm making is that you really need a multi-stakeholder platform. There is receptiveness, there is readiness as well, among the private sector players. We are seeing drones being used in other spaces. So I think it's time we start, sort of advocating collective call to action. That's all I had to say for now. Back to you, Huzefa.
No, thank you so much, Kavita. I think the points are extremely valid and pertinent, and the observations on the multi-stakeholder approach is absolutely spot on. And, the way I look at it also is that it is not as of today, but in the future, of course, productivity, the last mile and all of that can improve. But if it is a multi-stakeholder approach, one thing which we can also be prepared and anticipate for the future is relevant disaster management options which we can have. I think that will also go a long way in terms of responding to a crisis such as these if it comes in the near future. Yeah, and I think probably what would become extremely relevant at this point in time, and probably Aditi, you can weigh in out here, is basis your experience and your international experience with WEF and your past experiences. What sort of benefits are derived from such technologies? General thoughts would be great out here, Aditi.
Sure. Thanks, Huzefa, and thanks, Kavita, for those leading comments. Let me start by introducing what the center does and linking it back to what benefits do we see in implementing these emerging technologies. Much like the WRG group, which took birth from the World Economic Forum in 2008, the India Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution was established and launched in October 2018 by the Honorable Prime Minister. And this center comes as a leaf of our center, which was created in San Francisco 3 years back with the intent of actually making the public and the private stakeholders come together for adoption of emerging technologies in key domain sectors such as agriculture, health, education, so on and so forth, and also looking at how adoption of these technologies can be done and eased out by looking at the governance that may be acting as barriers to their larger adoption and scaling. So the center works on emerging technologies in India in coordination with Niti Aayog and several state governments which are working with us in tandem on some of these emerging technologies. And we are working through AI, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, data policy, blockchain, and drones, amongst various other things that we work. One of our first few programs, incidentally, when we started the center, was with the government of Maharashtra to look at agricultural drones. And really the problem statement started on the basis of the foundation of great work which was done by the forum already, which was looking at the entire agricultural supply chain and looking at a platform which comes out of the domain of the forum, which is called as the New Vision Agriculture. This platform is working across various countries, and it has been established along with the ecosystem of 700 organizations. It's present in 25 countries through Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we have catalyzed some 100+ value chain partnerships. And New Vision for Agriculture is one such partnership, which was emanated out of this platform on the food and agriculture. There are altogether 6 multi-stakeholder projects which are global and local level, and the global projects are being driven out of the India Center. Now, coming back to your question on what are the benefits being seen in adoption of these technologies, honestly, agriculture has been one of the few sectors which has seen slow adoption to emerging technologies and infusion of emerging technologies, but has been the biggest in terms of gaining through the efficiencies of these technologies. So that the ratios have been quite drastic. Internationally, we have seen that countries such as China, Korea, and Japan have actually harnessed these emerging technologies and actually have, they have sorted the challenges of growing labor shortage and urbanization and aging population, which are very akin to these countries. In China, so to speak, the adoption of drones for agricultural activities has been at such a scale that today they are actually looking at monitoring, agricultural land, which is roughly around 7 million hectares, and using drones. And the cost of surveillance has come down to 100 or 150 rupees for field crops such as rice, wheat, and maize. And while for specialized crops, it's somewhere between 250 to 400. So the economies of scales are huge. Now, while we speak of the advantages, we are aware that not all the countries are at the same level. So, we also need to find out what is actually the barriers to adoption and scale. So some of which were mentioned by Kavita, that there were certain emerging technologies which we saw in the green revolution. Because of the over usage of those technologies, it kind of actually gave let's say a disastrous impact to the crops. So therefore it's not like tech should be used just for the heck of using it. So emerging technologies have shown some unintended consequences that must be mitigated. So it's careful application of technology and what kind of technologies. There are different technologies that agriculture has. As Kavita mentioned, I'm going to talk about 4 sectors of technologies when it comes to agriculture. There's agronomy and agricultural biotechnology, which looks at innovating inputs from crop and animal agriculture, such as seeds, pests control, seeds with genomes, etc. Then there is mechanization, robotics, and on-farm machinery, such as automation, drones, GPS, satellites, so on and so forth. Then there is farm management software, Internet of Things. So we call as farm to table kind of concept. These include environmental farming data capture, using devices, decision support software, big data, and so on and so forth. And then there are novel, farming technology methods which have come into being and which are already being researched by our institutes such as Indian Council of Agricultural Research. These are indoor farms. There is aquaculture. There is LED farming using artificial light, which has more productivity. Now, these are broad contours or categories of agri-technology, so to speak. Coming back on what could hinder their adoption is also sometimes some specialized technology are very high cost technologies. And so, interventions in low cost and low tech solutions is something which is more feasible for India and therefore will show more efficiencies. There could also be that technology interventions which are run in isolation. They may not, give us the maximum impact because pilots generally are done on a small scale and on specialized crops, and they may not show the efficacy on a larger scale. So somewhere we have to find out between this whole financing mechanism is to how do we insert the fintech into the agri-tech technologies. Also, we have seen that the global investments, they do not reflect the potential of disruption in demand side innovation in developing countries, right? So companies such as Omnivore and others have actually looked at very specialized investments in agri-tech and how do they carefully harness these investments through these technology interventions. Also, the adoption and the scale of technology innovation is low. So this does not reflect how dynamic is the impact on the entire food value chain. Also, lastly but not the least, the enabling environment for technologies needs to be optimum so that they can thrive at local, country, and regional settings. So while we are talking about a state looking at piloting and actually getting results, it's not even about a state. It's not even about Maharashtra. It's not even about a state in South. It's not even about a state in East. I think this needs to be a federated program which needs a special place in our policies and regulations, where some of the other countries have led an example and have made those insertions and are now harnessing the efficiencies of these technologies. Now, given the situation that we are all in, the COVID-19 pandemic will absolutely call for insertion of these technologies. Effectiveness or opportunity cost happening or not happening, they will be the need of the hour, because we have the Rabi season, which is at the peak. So the harvesting is needed, and somewhere we have migrant labor force, traveling because of the insecurities, while there are also logistics and distribution systems which have just collapsed because of the lockdown. So I think the point over here is, do we really need to make sure that we wait for that technological ideal situation for its insertion, or we make that risk and we make that call through public and private cooperation and look at harnessing efficiencies through a future stage? I'm sorry for the long answer to a small question, but back to you, Huzefa. I hope that kind of makes sense on different parameters.
No, I think you summed it up really well, Aditi, especially giving an overview in terms of the very tech which actually applies in the agri space, in the agri-tech space, and more importantly, what is more realistic and what is more achievable. Again, I think that the key note which you and Kavita both have hit is that one is a multi-stakeholder approach, and of course, second, there has to be a public and private partnership, to facilitate the ecosystem. I just have one, additional point to add to both of y'all, and then probably we can move, forward. Is that we would not a straight size or a one size jacketed approach also may not work, right? Because unlike many other countries, India has different issues when it comes to agriculture. One nuance being that small and fragmented land holdings. Second, agricultural marketing is probably lacking. Storage facilities are kind of a problem. So I think when it comes to tech being a solution for this vertical, it would need to be more bespoke, more customized, as opposed to a brush which can be used to resolve all problems. Probably on that note, we can move forward. And a very relevant question which actually comes when implementing technology is that what is the regulatory landscape in India, from a tech perspective, and when tech is actually applied to the agriculture space. On this, it would be great if my colleague who's part of the regulatory and policy team, Prashant, could add some insights. Prashant, basis your experience and inputs, it would be great if you could just provide us an overview of this.
So, I mean, in terms of the legal and regulatory landscape for these emerging technologies in India, I must say that India is as good as any other country in the world right now. That is to say that it is in the early phase of, framing policies to regulate these technologies, and is evolving as we move along and we see more use cases of these technologies. Now, with respect to India, I must also say that India really realized the potential of these technologies very early in the day, somewhere around 2015, 2016, when the world was started to see more use cases of these technologies. And since then, it had started working towards creating a conducive environment for the growth of these newer technologies. Now, as far as use of such technologies in the agricultural space is concerned, there are primarily 4 types of technologies that may be suitable for this sector, and those could be drones, as all the panelists anyway spoke about its utility in this sector. Second could be the machine-to-machine technology. Third, the Internet of Things, which again was talked about. And robotics is another form of upcoming technology that can play an important role in this sector. Now, to discuss these technologies in further, let me first start with drones. So among the 4 technologies that I talked about, drone perhaps is the most evolved at this point in time. And there are several proof of concepts that are already available as to how this can help change the future of the agriculture around the world. Now, to regulate this space, there was a draft legislation that was introduced by the authorities in India in 2016, which became effective from late of 2018. And what it allows today is civil use of drones within a visual line of sight up to a prescribed height limit. Now, all of those parameters that are there under the current regulation is sufficient for most of the use cases that we may see in the agricultural space. However, there are some lacunas in terms of drones not being allowed to discharge any sort of payload, which may affect some of the use cases that the drone may be used for in the agriculture sector, such as spraying of fertilizers or say delivering of any good that may be required on those agricultural farms. But other than that, there are several other use cases that can be achieved through drone, and for that, there is an enabling framework available. However, even though it's almost been 1.5-year-old legislation, we have not seen civil use of drones being undertaken very actively, but it has been permitted on a case-to-case basis wherever necessary, and particularly even for agricultural use, there have been some exceptional permissions that have been granted, and some operations have been conducted basis that. So all in all, it is here to stay, and as we move along, I'm sure the regulations which are applicable for drone use will get streamlined, and that would allow drones to sort of serve the purpose that it is supposed to serve for the agricultural use. Now, moving on to the second form of technology, which is machine-to-machine learning. It is again evolving technology in terms of regulations. Currently, the authorities are in the process of capacity building, figuring out what are the legal challenges that may arise due to use of this technology. And keeping all of that in mind, there were some guidelines that were issued back in 2018 along the lines of the SIM cards that are typically used for the communication involved in machine-to-machine learning. And there it was mostly restrictive in nature, in the sense that the kind of security threats it may pose. There were some limitations imposed on how those SIM can be used for communication only between one identified party to begin with, which was later on relaxed, and it was allowed to it was allowed for interactions say up to four parties, and data sharing, which was earlier restricted only to 2 parties, was also allowed to 4 parties. So what it does is that it gives an opportunity to the innovators and incubators to innovate and test the effectiveness of these models and see how this can be, better used for serving the kind of need that the agriculture sector may have for this kind of technology going forward. And in terms of the use cases, we have seen several cases where this technology can be used. Next is the Internet of Things. Again, the regulatory landscape around this is in an evolving state. The authorities have taken note of this technology. A lot of studies are being conducted, both at the private parties level as well as the government level. There has been a center that has also been established by Ministry of Electronics and Information and Technology to look into the policies around Internet of Things. A policy paper was also released sometime in 2016, which after receiving several set of comments was revised, and what it does is it set out certain governance standards that that can be kept in mind while deploying this technology for future use. And therefore, it's again something that there is no well-defined set of regulations available in India at this point in time, but it's something that may evolve as and when more proof of concepts are established, and once more use cases of this technology is being identified, and particularly for agricultural space. Then the next technology is robotics. Now, robotics in the case of agriculture may not be what we think of robots as human-looking like figures, but it could be those automated machines that may be used for facilitating the agricultural process. And in this case, again, I mean, currently there are no specific guidelines, but what can be relied upon is the existing regulatory framework, which is there for the OEMs, that they have anyway be adhering to, because these robots, say, could be in the form of automated vehicle, and whatever norms are currently applicable on vehicle is what needs to be adhered to, unless it comes to a point where it is realized that there is enough disruption in this technology for it to be regulated separately. And among all of these technologies, one common point would be the data that they would be using and collecting in the process, which ultimately may classify them as a data fiduciary going forward, and in the new set of regulations that are being proposed. And therefore, they will have to be mindful of how they handle data. In most of these agricultural related cases, those data may be a non-personal data, and therefore maybe the proposed regulation may not cover it, but there is a committee that have been set up to sort of study the impact that can be there with respect to non-personal data. So maybe in the future, we may see some regulations being framed around that, but at least currently what we can say is there is room for innovation, and that is what would sort of give the authorities a chance to understand as to whether there is a need to regulate such technology, or whether that would hamper the innovation. So I guess that's pretty much it on the regulatory landscape that we currently have in India on this, Huzefa. So over to you.
Yeah. No, thanks, Prashant. I think you broke it really well into 4 buckets. I think the immediate question which comes, basis what you just said, is that are there any sort of hurdles which kind of restrict the implementation of these technologies, whether it could be regulatory hurdles or whether it could be technology hurdles by itself? I think one, common underlying principle to all of this is, Prashant, is that from an Indian landscape perspective, the farmer strata is not a very rich farmer when you take the entire base or the entire population. There would be pockets of farmers who are having large holdings and the more sophisticated ones, but the general population would be a mid strata or a lower strata. So capital investments, because any which ways, considering that the uncertainties which is with soil, rain, seeds, any sort of capex investments in agriculture would be a little difficult and challenging for them to implement. Having said that, a lot of companies are actually providing technology as a service. It's something similar as a software as a service, where agri-tech is also becoming as a service. Now, that is a great way of crossing hurdles when it comes to capex investments. There are a few companies. Cropin is one of the more prominent ones. Example being that IBM has also launched a particular thing called Weather Company. In addition to that, there are a lot of apps which are providing these services, to kind of facilitate and minimize capex investments. So one way forward to actually cross implementation hurdles in technology is whereby service providers and the private sector with the public sector come together and provide this more as a service. The other larger issue is also digital penetration. Yes, India has scored across the world the second highest number of internet users in the world. But unfortunately, only 20% of those are from rural India, and that is the larger agricultural belt of the country. So digital penetration in rural India, of course, which is happening, and the internet is only growing, this will only aid in implementation of new age verticals and new technologies. I think the third particular issue which is actually faced from an implementation perspective is just legacy and culture. a lot of people in India are not very receptive to new things or new change. And what doesn't help is the literacy rate which we are dealing with when it comes to the broader population at hand. So culture and illiteracy put together is not a great combination, but it's not that things are not changing. It is improving, but we hope that it improves further. Last but not the least, you actually mentioned a very interesting vertical, which is drones. Across the world, in my opening remarks, I mentioned a few countries. They are small countries, but very efficient and highly productive. The likes of Netherlands, Israel, or Japan. Now, all these countries extensively use drones. In fact, for larger farmlands, whether it is Australia, America, New Zealand, deployment of drones is an essential ingredient when it comes to agri-tech. But when you look at it from an Indian perspective, even if it needs to be offered as a service, it's kind of difficult because the bottlenecks which actually surround the law. So just to actually summarize, this in 3 pointers. Today, if any farmer or in the aggregate space, if drones need to be deployed, based on the current law, they have to fly within visual line of sight. But if they need to drop anything, like, if any disinfectants needs to be dropped, for example, they need permission on each flight basis. Now that becomes extremely cumbersome, whereby, each time permission is gone and taken. The other second bottleneck is that drone operations beyond visual line of sight are not permitted in existing regulations. Yes, there is a lot of talk and there's a lot of buzz that the law is going to open up, and we hope that it opens up really soon. But currently, that also acts as a bottleneck. I think the third thing that within the existing regime, the approval process for what is permissible is also not very receptive. I know that things are being ironed out and promises have been made. Let's hope that post the COVID lockdown, things improve. Last but not the least, the issues also of foreign participation. The current laws actually block foreign participation in this particular drone sector. In fact, if things open up, not only will technology also come in, but there are various verticals which may actually benefit from it, including last mile logistical issues. So I thought, these are the few issues, Prashant, which would actually come up from an implementation perspective, not only from a pure play regulatory perspective, but even from a tech perspective. Probably you can move forward, and it would be good if Aditi, basis international experience, can share learnings across the vertical, and how global learnings can actually facilitate the Indian ecosystem. Over to you, Aditi.
Sorry, I double muted it. No, thanks, Huzefa. And I think what you have mentioned and what Prashant has mentioned about different technologies and how there are impediments to its adoption in India, so to speak. I think there's a lot that we can learn from our Asian neighbors, and I wouldn't even go to Ireland or to Netherlands or to other European countries who may be considered as developed economies and therefore have the ability to invest what it takes into these technologies. I think, as I had mentioned earlier, China, Korea, and Japan themselves have been doing this because they are not necessarily facing the challenges that what Europe is facing. They are very closer to our own home territory, and these are essentially what we will be facing in the future, which is shortage of labor and also a huge risk and contamination of what will happen to the crops and the harvest because of the whole pandemic that we are going through. So essentially, I think what we have looked and what we have done. I could also draw a comparison to a program that we are currently running in Kenya, which is on Innovation with a Purpose platform. The Innovation with the Purpose platform was launched by the forum back in 2018 when we came up with our first report, which was the role of technology in accelerated food system transformation. And in 2019, we came up with the second version of this report, which was improving traceability in food value chain through technology innovation. Both these reports are actually looking at insertion of technology in agriculture not necessarily through agriculture as what we understand as core agriculture, but we look at agriculture as a coordination of the entire value chain. And I think India has to take lessons from looking at the entire value chain and not segregating the parts of these value chain, where then the insertion of technology may seem to be very big task in terms of finance and in terms of what it takes to implement it. And what does this whole ecosystem look like? The ecosystem of this whole food value chain consists of farmers, it consists of the government, it consists of the international organizations, public-private bodies, industry bodies. They have the startup innovators, they have the consumers, the civil society bodies, and the NGOs, which actually look at representing farmer bodies and stuff like that, and the academia included, who are doing a lot of research in what would make technology more feasible for a country like ours. Now, coordinated approach across this whole spectrum of production, processing, distribution, retailing, and consumption should be looked into for insertion of technology. And many of the countries have now looked at the entire value chain instead of just looking at agriculture, and therefore have been able to make economic models which then turn to be more feasible and more palatable, if I may say so. Now, the approach that we have taken in designing this whole innovation with purpose platform is that we look at a coordinated entity that connects across all of these ecosystem players, which I talked about, which is farmers, governments, all of them. Then it focuses on local, country, and regional opportunities and challenges. So identify with the farmer the local opportunities, identify with the federated government structures, such as government looking at their priorities. We already have a doubling farmers' income vision that is already has placed by the government. They themselves are thinking, how will they do that if they do not look at the entire agricultural value chain? And the third step that we look in this approach is that we promote collaboration through multi-stakeholder and market-based collaboration. What we have seen in Kenya, where these discussions have just started, and I'm taking the example of Kenya because that's a developing economy just like India, is that some of the outcomes that we've looked at is that it leads to, with this approach, it leads to looking at equitable access of innovation and technology across smallholder farmers and consumers. So we just talked about how there is a high barrier to the entry because of the capital investment. When you look at the entire value chain, you distribute the cost of these interventions across the value chain, so you can look at equitable access of innovation. You also see that there is increased investment in scalable technology, because what happens is you are promoting policy incentives because the government wants to tick box on their vision, while at the same time a farmer wants to make sure that they have having higher crop yield, while at the same time the industries are looking for larger produce to manage the demands. What is also very a trivia that I have read somewhere, and which is also will be proven, is that agriculture sector is the only sector in this entire pandemic which is a bright light for all of us. Essentially, that's supposedly one of the only sectors which will not be affected by the pandemic as it would affect many other industries. So we could also foresee increased investments in this sector, because this also becomes a sector of survival, so to speak. One of the other outcomes that we have seen through the Kenyan pilot or example that we are looking at is that we have to mitigate unintended consequences of technology. What is the deterrent to technology adoption is when it gives you failed results. And how can you mitigate those failed results? So application of technology, as I've said, and I will underline it in the beginning, careful application of technology is very useful. We know drones are useful, but that doesn't mean that just use drones for the heck of it. Analyze why you need drones, what will it do for you, and then how will it impact the entire value chain. And these are the experiences that we have learned firsthand. When we went into Maharashtra to talk about these things, we first started looking into silos of problems. We looked at agriculture, then it got conjoined with the water ecosystem, then it got conjoined with the irrigation ecosystem, and that led to people like us connecting with each other, such as Kavita and myself. But the idea is that you're harnessing the entire value chain when you're looking at technology investments, and which is what developing economies are doing. And then because you're working through this coordinated approach, then you are also looking at unlocking institutional blocks, because when there is a piece for everybody to benefit, institutional bottlenecks will automatically be unlocked. Now, what are the key activities that I would want to very quickly summarize that we are doing as part of these innovation hubs? They are called as innovation with purpose. Is we are looking at fostering and cultivating innovation for localized impact. So we are trying to link with innovators, entrepreneurs, and SMEs to the entire value chain players. And we are also looking at understanding collective problem solving. So we earlier talked about, and Kavita also talked about FPOs. There are several FPOs, which are working to project farmer interest in India. Now, these FPOs can actually do localized problem solving. And when I say localized problem solving, the intensive cost of using technology burden can come down if we actually look at group loans, for example. So a drone can be loaned by a cluster of villages, and then the drone could do mapping for the entire villages by the cost being divided between these FPOs or the farmers. So such innovative problem solving, localized problem solving needs to be there. And then as part of this first leg of fostering, cultivating innovation for localized impact, we are then addressing innovation gaps. And these innovation gaps will enable healthier and sustainable food environment, specifically for low income settings. So this is part one, or pillar one, of how we are designing the activities of innovation hubs. The second activity of this innovation hub is that we are then supporting the delivery and adoption of this technology innovation. So once this local problem solving has been done, some kind of a solution has been created, and some kind of a collective problem solving has been done, we then try to scale the delivery and adoption by facilitating capacity of farmers and improving their skills and adoption of these technologies. So while you can give a paper and a pen, until you tell the farmers how to write, they won't be able to use those technologies. So skilling is an important agenda of technology adoption and insertion as well. As part of the second pillar, we are also looking at enabling collaboration between farmers and again other value chain players, so that there is linkages to the market value pricing of their crops as well. And then, of course, as I said, the skilling programs or the training programs. The third pillar of the activity of the Innovation Hub is developing a global community of practice and action. What would that involve is mobilizing the research effect that is being happening through institutes such as the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, or scientists who are doing aqua farming related researches, to not necessarily create a very high scale technology intervention which may not be able to scale back. So this coordinated effort of research versus what is needed for localized impact, that connection has to be done. Then we need to address global level opportunities. We are already doing this. Now the Global Innovation Hub for Food and Agriculture has been mobilized, as I said, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we have these innovation hubs, which we are now planning to localize through creation of regional hubs. And one such hub will be mobilized for India. And that will help us harness global level opportunities. Forum already comes with its global set of innovators. And when I say innovators, these innovators are global innovators who are actually making a difference in creating new technologies at a lower cost, who are creating a lot of disruption. So as you mentioned, Cropin, Satsure, Amnex, some of these companies who are really have created a great amount of business through this AGRITECH are part of our council and are part of the Innovator Council. And if an Indian company is speaking to an Israeli company, because the center that is there in India is a part of a series of center that is working in San Francisco, China, Japan, and India, but also now is present in several other affiliate countries, such as Israel, Colombia, South Africa, UAE, so on and so forth. So what we've done is we've enabled the collaboration between regional innovation hubs where a farmer or a farmer producer organization or a B2F organization or a B2B organization sitting in India can speak to an Israeli corporation and understand how did they overcome challenges. So this global connectivity is also very important to harness that efficiency in technology. So, yeah, those are the melange of experiences and what we are doing through different parts of the world that is facilitating adoption of technology at a large scale.
I think excellent comments, from an international perspective, Aditi. I think 3 touch points, right? I think when you're looking at the chain, you have to look at the entire ecosystem, the end-to-end, the full chain. A second is that you made a very pertinent note that if you're troubleshooting, it has to be specific. So troubleshooting in a vacuum probably doesn't help. It has to be objective troubleshooting. You also mentioned a point on investments. Just one other comment which I would want to make on that is, this particular industry can also consider social impact funding. I think that will go a long way to actually enhance this particular vertical. But considering the paucity of time, probably, Kavita, you may want to come in out here. And considering your practical experiences on ground, it would be great if you can sum up, how can these technologies be actually implemented on ground in India? That would be great if you could provide some more thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Huzefa, and I think thank you, Aditi, for those very, very insightful and valuable comments. I think I liked a few things from what all of you just said, and I'm going to use that to reiterate these points. One is, I think, Huzefa, you said that one size fits all doesn't work, and I think especially in this context, the technology needs to be more bespoke and more customized. And while we can learn from our Asian neighbors, I think some solutions need to be native, even if it's across the value chain, but they can be native. And I agree with you, Aditi, when you said that, this needs to be a federated program, and there are a lot of localized, solution solving problems that FPOs are resolving today. And that there is a need for integration of fintech and agri-tech. And I think that's a lot of good work happening in that space that really needs to come together. And I think, again, I would, go back to the original point that I made, that this is something that we can do practically through a multi-stakeholder platform. I mean, there are many dimensions to this, which is defining the problem statement, which is what I think both of you alluded to very clearly, that don't troubleshoot in the dark, get specific. So I think it's important to define the problem statement. What are we trying to solve for? And then define the use cases arising from the problem statement. This is something that even some of the senior officials we have been talking to in some of the states we are working have told us. And then I think we also need to look at the regulatory framework and what needs to be eased out there, not just from the technical side, but also the financial side. For instance, CSR rules currently state that in the 2% spend, overhead costs cannot exceed 5% of the total CSR spend, which includes, I think, payment for staff and service providers. So this creates a bit of a challenge since, CSR pooling vehicle may have limited ability to put the money at best use by engaging external talent. And they may be unlikely to be able to build, in-house expertise in drones for use of agriculture as an implementation or monitoring tool to build resilience and create the desired impact. But however, if this rule was relaxed, I think it would be able to engage appropriate service providers and spend the funds to the fullest extent possible. Then, like you just said, Huzefa, I think impact funds would be a great source of, a great avenue that we can dip into. So I think we also need to identify the players, understand the costs in a lot more granularity, do a cost benefit analysis, architect a go-to-market strategy, as it were, to the government, and then go to the government rather than saying, there is a lot of research. Everyone knows a lot about how this is useful, what's happening in the rest of the world, and possibly in India. I mean, these have been tried in many states in India, but I think now is the time to really take it to the next level. Also, the government may be willing to be a lot more flexible and receptive in these times from a regulatory perspective, given the need and applications from a COVID-19 context. So I think we need to look at how we integrate our offering to existing states in the project, existing projects in the states as well. For example, Maharashtra has a project on climate resilient agriculture, which is more on input management, and it's a very well defined. It's a World Bank funded project, but very actively working in 15 drought prone districts in the state. And we also have the SMART project, which is the state of Maharashtra's agriculture and rural transformation project, and they are working more on market linkages. So rather than appearing to reinvent the wheel, can we look at how some of our offerings and propositions can be dovetailed into existing projects? All these projects have climate. I mean, Pokhara, for example, has a climate innovation center. They have a digital innovation lab. I'm sure Government of Maharashtra has a drones. I'm told Government of Maharashtra has a drone cell. So how do we look at integrating our offerings into existing projects or existing work that the government is already doing, so that we don't appear to be reinventing the wheel? And I think, therefore, this needs an intensive discussion with the government and the other stakeholders. We're happy to facilitate those discussions and work on these dimensions. And so to conclude, I would say that we need all stakeholders to work collectively to come up with a proposition which is socio-economically desirable, which I think this is, technologically feasible, financially viable, administratively doable, and regulatorily tenable. And obviously, an MSP platform is best suited to stitch these pieces together.
I think, Kavita, it couldn't have been summed up better, that the path, if it needs to be segued, it has to be a multi-stakeholder platform. That's the only way we can move towards a win-win situation for everybody involved in this ecosystem. I think we are spot on when it comes to time, but we have Nishith Desai as well with us on the panel. I think he would be happy to make some overarching comments. Over to you, Nishith bhai.
Yeah, thank you very much, Huzefa, Prashant, of course, Aditi and Kavita. Aditi, it's been wonderful being part of World Economic Forum, and of course being part of the champion as well, new champion as well. I think a lot of interesting things we can do. Kavita, wonderful to be interacting with you. I think all of us are in some ways multi-stakeholders, and we can do so much. My personal feel is that drones is likely to create maximum amount of employment as well, because unmanned drones are not permitted. So you need 2 people to try, whatever, And there are so many other things that are coming up. So we have heavily focused on drones, and our team has been working very hard. I think you also indicated, Kavita, that government could be a little flexible, and only thing government needs to do is to understand the speed. I think that is where since 2018 we have been talking about drones. Everybody knows the advantages and stuff like that. We should have actually used drones during this COVID-19 time, because for example, delivery of medicine, injections, vaccines, food, vegetables, and some of those things are very easy to do. And I think Rwanda, a small country like Rwanda, has made tremendous use of drones. They don't build roads, they just use drones. Because in future, whether we'll need roads at all is also a question mark, because in the rough terrain or otherwise, it would be, very, difficult. And when you invest so much money in roads, and now who is using roads? All cars are off the roads now. But at the same time, you want to deliver things, you want to act, even flying cars will become a reality in next 5 years. And in 10 years time, it will be common mode of transportation, So I think that drones has huge future, and we just need to work towards how do we make them more eco-friendly and stuff like that, and immediately bring in some regulations, at least on a, what you call sandbox species, if nothing else, Now today, this opportunity was great, and even still continues to be great. We should instantaneously bring in something, even by way of ordinance, even if by some kind of regulations, but within those limits, let us start experimenting. We don't have a day to delay the whole, drone usage in India, and particularly in cities like Mumbai. So it would be very useful. Also, it can reach out to the people in towns and villages. So even if vaccine comes, how will you deliver all over India? I think many things like that would be happening. I don't want to take too much time away from this. But let us continue to work together. I think, as I mentioned, my only concern is that great ideas, great opportunity, great everything in front of us. I think the speed is missing, and I hope governments do understand the need of speed. Thank you.